Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive into something pretty interesting. We're going to be exploring anger.
Anger.
Yeah, but it's not what you think. We're looking at anger and how it connects to destiny.
Oh, okay. That's intriguing. Like how it impacts our path.
Yeah, exactly. The sources we're looking at today actually suggest that anger can, steal your destiny. Pretty wild, right?
Wow. That's a strong statement.
It is. So to unpack all of this, we've got two sources. One is an excerpt from Testo and Collado,
Okay.
and the other is a Christian podcast episode. How does anger steal your destiny?
Interesting. So I've got like a philosophical and a spiritual perspective.
Exactly. And both of them actually start by defining this idea of irritability. They describe it as like that state of being easily angered, when your emotions kind of take over and logic goes out the window.
Oh, I know that feeling. Like when something small happens, you just snap.
Yeah, totally. Like someone cuts you off in traffic and you're fuming for the rest of the drive.
Exactly.
Ah.
Or when your internet crashes right before a deadline.
Oh. Ugh, the worst. And Testo and Collado takes this idea of irritability even further with the concept of the tripartite nature of man: spirit, body, and soul.
Tripartite nature.
Yeah, it basically says that when you're super irritable, it means your soul, like your emotions, are dominating your spirit, which is where, your rational thoughts come from.
Okay, so it's like that constant tug of war between logic and emotion,
Mm.
and irritability means emotions are winning.
Precisely. And while the tripartite concept comes from Testo and Collado, I think the idea of an internal struggle resonates across different belief systems. It's all about how we navigate those moments when, feelings try to take over.
It's so true. How many times have we all reacted emotionally and then thought, "Ugh, I wish I'd handled that differently."
Right. And that's where the spiritual aspect comes in. Both sources, even though they come from different angles, both connect irritability to a lack of spiritual maturity.
Oh, interesting. Can you elaborate on that a little?
Sure. So the Christian podcast talks about the fruits of the Spirit mentioned in the Bible, love, joy, peace, patience, all that good stuff.
Right, right. Qualities that anger definitely doesn't embody.
Exactly. It's like they're on opposite ends of the spectrum. And both sources are basically saying that if those positive traits signal spiritual growth, then anger and irritability might be indicators of areas where we still need to mature.
Hmm. That's a thought-provoking way to look at it. It's not just about behavior, it's about inner development.
Absolutely. And speaking of behavior, the podcast goes on to highlight just how damaging uncontrolled anger can be. They even quote Proverbs 17.22, which says, "A cheerful heart is good medicine, but a crushed spirit dries up the bones."
Wow, that's a powerful image. It really emphasizes that anger doesn't just affect us mentally or emotionally, but it can have physical consequences too.
Exactly. It's not just an internal thing. It ripples outwards, affecting our relationships, our work, and even our health.
Like, the podcast actually draws a link between chronic anger and stress, which we know can lead to a whole bunch of health problems.
Right. And then there's the impact on relationships. The podcast gives some pretty powerful examples of how unresolved anger can just erode trust and create distance between people.
Oh, yeah. Like, I've seen how holding on to anger can completely change the dynamic between two people. It's like it creates this wall that's hard to break down.
Totally. And that brings us to the most interesting part of all of this: how irritability and anger actually tie into the idea of destiny.
Destiny. Okay, now I'm really curious. How does anger affect our ability to, shape our own lives?
Well, both sources suggest that a person who is ruled by irritability is essentially giving up control. Instead of consciously making choices, they become reactive, letting circumstances and their emotions dictate their actions.
Hmm. So it's like being a puppet with anger pulling the strings. We're not really in the driver's seat anymore.
Exactly, and the podcast uses this great analogy. Imagine a leaf being blown around by the wind. That's what a life controlled by irritability can feel like. There's no clear direction, just constant reaction.
That's a striking image. And it makes you wonder, how can we connect with that sense of purpose and hope that, say, the Bible talks about if we're constantly being tossed around by our anger?
Right. Like, remember Jeremiah 29.11? It says that God has a plan for us, a future filled with hope. But how can we tap into that potential if we're always reacting in the moment?
It's like, how can we build a future if we're always stuck putting out fires in the present? So if anger can be this much of a roadblock, what are we supposed to do about it?
That's a great question, and it's exactly what we'll be exploring when we come back. Both sources actually offer some really practical steps for overcoming irritability and reclaiming that control over our lives.
Okay, I'm definitely interested to hear more about that because, let's be real, who wouldn't want to ditch the anger and create a life that feels more fulfilling?
Right. Stay tuned. We'll be diving into those strategies after the break. So before the break, we are getting into how anger can really mess with our goals and aspirations, almost like it throws up roadblocks on our path.
Yeah, it's like a constant detour. And it's not always these big blow-ups. It can be these small choices and reactions driven by irritability that kind of lead us away from where we want to be.
So it's more like death by a thousand paper cuts,
Yeah.
right? All those little frustrations adding up over time.
Exactly. And you know what's tricky? Anger can be sneaky. Like, it disguises itself as something else,
Oh, like what?
like righteousness, protectiveness, even strength sometimes.
I see what you mean. Like, we convince ourselves that our anger is justified, but really it's just eating away at our peace and holding us back.
Exactly. And this goes back to what we were saying before about spiritual maturity. It's about
Yeah.
recognizing those patterns in ourselves, being honest about when anger is driving the bus, even if we try to rationalize it.
It's like instead of always blaming other people or circumstances, we have to take responsibility for our own reactions.
Right. And the sources we're looking at offer some really practical ways to do that. In addition to the things we talked about before, like prayer and self-control, they emphasize this idea of extending grace.
Grace. Okay, that's interesting. But how do you extend grace when you're feeling angry or hurt?
Well, it doesn't mean you have to condone bad behavior or pretend everything's okay when it's not. It's more about approaching those tough situations with compassion and understanding.
So instead of getting caught up in blame and resentment, we shift our focus to empathy and forgiveness.
Right. And remember, grace starts with ourselves. We have to be kind to ourselves, acknowledge our own imperfections and all that.
That makes sense. It's like that saying, you can't pour from an empty cup.
Exactly. We can't offer genuine compassion to others if we're beating ourselves up all the time.
So true. And when we start practicing grace, both internally and externally, something really cool happens. It's like we're creating space for healing and growth and deeper connections.
You got it. And ultimately, that's what we all want, right? To
Yeah.
live a life that's not controlled by anger, but guided by, our values and our desire to connect with ourselves and the world around us.
Speaking of values, earlier we were talking about how anger can sabotage our dreams and goals. It's like we put up these roadblocks for ourselves. Do you think there's a connection between practicing grace and unlocking that potential?
Definitely. When we let go of anger and resentment, it frees up so much mental and emotional energy,
Right.
energy that we can then direct towards, what really matters to us.
It's like clearing out the clutter in our minds. It makes space for new possibilities.
Exactly. And as we cultivate grace, we also become more open to the good things in life.
It's like we're trading in those old, worn-out maps of anger and resentment for a brand new compass, one that points us in a more positive direction.
I like that. It's about shifting from a mindset of scarcity and fear, which anger often feeds on, to a mindset of abundance and possibility.
That's a great way to put it. And when we approach life from that place of openness, we're much more likely to attract the things that we truly desire.
Exactly. It's a journey, not a destination, though, right? There will be times when we stumble, when we fall back into those old patterns.
That's true. But the important thing is to keep practicing, keep choosing grace, and remember that we have the power to create a life that aligns with our aspirations.
You got it. We're not defined by our anger. We have the capacity to choose a different path, one that leads to peace and joy and fulfilling our potential. Before we move on, though, I'm curious to hear what stood out to you from all of this.
What really resonated with me was that emphasis on personal responsibility. It's so easy to blame our anger on other people or situations, but these sources really challenge us to look inward and see how we're contributing to those cycles of anger.
Yeah, it's about taking ownership of our emotions and choosing how we respond instead of just playing the victim.
Exactly. And it's empowering, to realize that we actually have more control than we think. It's not about denying the validity of those external factors, but recognizing that we always have a choice in how we react to them.
Right. We can choose to fuel the anger, or we can choose to cultivate something more positive, like patience or understanding, maybe even a sense of humor.
It's like we're choosing to water the flowers instead of the weeds in our mental garden.
Exactly. We have the power to create a more peaceful inner landscape. And that peace then ripples outward, impacting our interactions and experiences.
It's like creating a positive feedback loop. And ultimately, that's what leads to a more fulfilling life, right?
Yeah.
One that's filled with more joy, deeper connections, and a sense of purpose that can't be stolen by anger.
Couldn't have said it better
Um,
myself. It's a practice that takes effort and attention and grace, but the rewards are totally worth it.
Okay, I'm ready for part 3. What's that mind-blowing question you hinted at?
Oh, you'll see. Stay tuned.
Okay, so spill the beans. What's that thought-provoking question you mentioned?
All right, get this. What if anger isn't always a bad thing?
Wait, really? I thought we were on the same page about ditching anger. Are you saying there's, like, a good side to it?
Well, think about it. Anger usually pops up when we feel threatened or when our values are being challenged.
So it's more about what's causing the anger and not the anger itself.
Exactly. It's like a signal, letting us know that something's not right.
Okay, I'm listening.
And sometimes that anger can actually push us to do something positive, to stand up for ourselves or for what we believe in.
I guess I can see that, like when people get fired up about injustice and it fuels them to make a change.
Exactly. Like think about historical figures like Martin Luther King Jr. They used their anger at oppression to create positive change.
So it's not about pretending we don't feel anger, but learning to use it constructively.
Right. It's about recognizing that energy and passion and channeling it towards something good.
I like that. So instead of seeing anger as the enemy, we can see it as a tool.
Yeah, a tool that can be used for growth or even for, like, making the world a better place.
It's all about recognizing when it's helpful and when it's harmful.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. It's about becoming the master of our anger, not letting it master us, which takes, a lot of self-awareness.
Like figuring out what triggers us and why.
Yeah, and then making conscious choices about how we want to respond.
It's not about becoming emotionless, but learning to manage those emotions.
Exactly. And when we find that balance, we unlock anger's true potential. It doesn't steal our destiny. It becomes part of our journey.
Wow, this has been such an interesting conversation. I'm definitely looking at anger differently now.
Me too. It's not something to be afraid of, but something to understand.
And to use wisely.
Right. And remember, you don't have to figure all of this out on your own. Talking to someone you trust, like a friend or a therapist, can really help.
That's great advice. Ultimately, we have the power to choose how anger affects our lives.
So choose wisely. Your destiny's in your hands.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into anger and destiny. Until next time, keep exploring and keep growing.
See you next time.